Welcome back to David's Shining Star. This is episode 3. I'd like to begin today's show with a Happy New Year to all. I pray for those who are grieving, and particularly with those who have suffered a recent loss. As you enter a new year, I pray that you would enter it with hope and determination to live as whole and healthy as possible. Learn to find healthy ways to grieve. Since beginning this podcast, I've heard from a few who have endured some of the most tragic experiences with loss. Hopefully, in the near future, we'll be able to share some of those, but I would dare not read anyone's comments or any of their encounters with grief, as it would be their story to tell. And as I've read some of those experiences, it reminds me that there are always others who have faced harder times than I have. So try to remember that, because no matter how difficult of a time you're enduring, someone else has probably endured something even harder. Not to even think about it or even to try to imagine it. But those of us who walk in grief have our own journey, and it can be very tough. I tried for many years to bring in the New Year's, as everyone else did, to have the same joy and hope and excitement for a new year that most have. But without my son in the picture, is very difficult. It's very hard to imagine what that year would be without him there, and how could I enjoy it? And so, when this year hit, and I woke up on New Year's Day, I opened up my normal social media and my news feed that I read, and I see this violent attack has occurred on innocent people in New Orleans. And although there's still much that's unknown about this incident, we do know that at least 14 people and the terrorist were killed as he turned that corner. And I watched the video of the truck entering onto Bourbon Street, just a few blocks away from where we would stay and where we stay when we go to New Orleans. We typically stay in a hotel that's, about a block or so off of Bourbon. We have to cross Canal. And right there at that crossing point is where this truck entered. I watched the video. As he made the corner, he peeled out and started hitting people. And it was on this intersection where we've entered dozens of times. New Orleans always has had a special place in my heart. My father lived there for years, and so I spent a lot of summers there. I spent a lot of time there, and since then I've spent a lot of time there. But I am still in so much shock following this tragedy, to the point of not wanting to mention it. However, I know that there are family and loved ones connected to those who've lost their lives that are forever impacted by this. There are many who were present and witnessed this tragedy, and they will never be the same. It's very hard to imagine the impact and struggle that those families are enduring and will continue to go through over the loss of their kids, family members, and friends. Additionally, the trauma endured from these bystanders is almost impossible to imagine. They will never be the same, and I pray that they get some counseling, because it's going to be very tough for them. But no matter, everybody involved will never be the same, and a tremendous amount of grief lies ahead for many people. So our prayers and thoughts are with the people of New Orleans, those who were affected and those who were present. To be honest, I almost skipped doing this episode, and I've struggled getting it out because of the internal emotions that stirred up within me. They could easily overtake me and just put me in a bad place, just being honest. In our last episode, I finished with the funeral of my son David and the grief counseling that I attended. They say it's best to refrain from making life-changing decisions for a while following the loss of a loved one. I know too many stories of marriages falling apart after the loss of a child. No matter what, we become forever changed. So let's discuss some of the things that hit me in the days, weeks, and months following the loss of my son. This is not the rule book. This is not a playbook that everybody follows, because everybody walks differently with it, and the emotions that come with it come at different times. And so I'm just telling you my story. So one of the first things that I endured, no doubt, was just this extreme amount of sorrow, the extreme amount of confusion, and then just the deep depression that hit. I stayed numb for weeks, probably longer than that. I probably stayed numb for months. And it took time for these things to work their way in my life. So the next emotion to make an entrance was anger. I was so excited that my son was making a move toward entering the world of safety to help others. That's gone now. It was lost. Something that I did that he wanted to do, something that excited him, is no longer around. And it made me angry. I want to be honest. Why would God allow this when David and I had gotten so close? We talked almost every day. And I know God knew all of this, and maybe that's why that he and I had drawn so close, because we literally talked every day, and we talked about everything. We talked about his work. He wanted to hear my thoughts and opinions about everything. He wanted to know how I felt about him working, and I let him know. I just helped him through some rough patches in his relationships with others. I had to remind him that it's not worth being angry over, and that you needed to move on with life and not let anger and bad situations with others get to him. He was one of the most easygoing people that you could ever find. And the one thing about David that I learned, and I'll talk about this more, is that he learned how to get through that and didn't stay angry very long with people. But I was angry at myself because here I'd moved 1,000 miles away from him, and yet he wanted to hear from me when we talked. A lot of kids go through those teenage years and don't particularly like their parents, and often don't want to hear what the parents have to say. My parents are stupid, they're idiots. But my son at 23, he wanted it. And that thrilled me so much that I looked forward to that conversation that we had every day. I looked forward to when he came to visit me up there, the last time that I would see him. I looked forward to those times. Little did I know they would be some of the most precious times, because now he'd be taken away. What would I give right now to be able to pick up that phone and speak with him now? I typically do not ask for help with much of anything. I'm just proud that way, I guess, and that's just me. But I know David would be here in a few minutes if I needed him for anything. All I would have had to do is pick up the phone, text him whatever, son, I need some help. He'd be there as soon as he could. But because of that, to this day, I struggle with allowing anybody to help me because of the hole that was left in my heart that no one can fill. My mind thinks if my son can't be here to help me, how can I accept someone else's help? Not a good thing to think necessarily, but that's just the way my process worked. Because in my mind and heart, no one can ever take the place of David. And no one can ever take the place of your loved one. No one. There's some that God allows to be put in our lives. And I do believe that God places those people in our lives for reasons. So just know that if we allow, there can be comfort in having others enter our lives for good. And what I've come to find out after a number of years is I've been blessed with that. And I've been blessed with it very recently. It's very easy to shut everybody out. And I did that for a long time. So it's good to be able to now open up some and allow somebody else to share in some of those things. Once again, it's not going to be the same. I'm not asking or wanting it to be the same. Nothing will be the same without my son in my life. And so it makes it very difficult sometimes to let anyone into that circle of grief for various reasons. I know I've never wanted anyone else to have to feel the same way I have since David's passing. And when I read these stories and I read others in their journeys with grief, it strikes my heart just as bad for them because I know they're going through very, very tough times. But I don't need anybody else to feel sorry for me. And I'm sure most of you would agree. You're not looking for somebody else to feel sorry for you. You're just trying to struggle with the whys and the hardships of dealing with grief. And it makes it a very good reason to join in with some others so at least you can relate to the pain we go through. No one else can walk my path of grief, and neither can I walk your path. But as a minimum, we understand the hardships of grief, and we can at least offer support to one another. If there's something that I do that helps you, then that's fantastic. If there's something that you do, and I've read many things that help me, that's absolutely wonderful. I suppose the next obstacle I would face would be guilt. And as a parent, I'm sure many have felt that, and there's many who have lost loved ones and feel that same guilt. After all, my career was safety. If I'd just been there, maybe I could have taught my son more about water safety. Maybe I could have taught him more about risk recognition and the importance of wearing a life jacket. As a parent, it's my job to protect my family, and I didn't protect him. It was extremely difficult to get past that one. You may think that I should not have allowed those thoughts to enter my mind, but they did. And God would have to help me through this one. As time would go on, I'd come to the realization, and I came to it, that it wasn't my fault. But it took a while to get there, believe me, because I just placed this guilt on me. And it was a process. After losing my only son, I traveled through my memories, and as many do, and you try to relive anything and everything that you can about your loved ones. And I did that with David as well. I taught David how to swim, and I went back to those memories. To be honest, when he was learning how to swim, we had a few close calls with him, but I was there, right? And I remember him struggling in the water, but he was so self-confident, and he somewhat was a daredevil, that it didn't bother him to just jump right in and think he could swim. And I remember having to pull him out of the water before he struggled to stay afloat. But due to that close call, it allowed us to understand we really needed to make sure he knew how to swim. And so it never dawned on me, though, that I maybe should teach him how to rescue someone else. That's not an easy thing to teach, because it's not an easy task when someone's drowning to try to save them, because they become very strong and they will overpower you, and just exactly what happened with my son. And the thought of these boys drowning has probably been one of the toughest things for me to handle. If you allow yourself to think about how it is to drown, what is that experience? And I've read a lot of things about it and went through a lot of things, which may or may not have helped my grief, but it helped me to realize and understand exactly what happened. And that's what you question. What happened? Why did it happen? And so in doing that, it stirred up a lot of emotions, and it became very, very difficult. In fact, it actually caused me to despise boats and anything on the water for a long time. And if I put too much thought into it, I would become a basket case of anxiety. I basically had a choice to make. Either take that blame on myself or try to turn it into something good. What would I have done as a safety professional? The obvious answer to me, and most would agree, was what we say, personal protective equipment. That's not the best answer always, but it was an obvious answer because he didn't have a life jacket on. He had one in the boat. He was legal according to the law. And the law in Texas at that point stated that if you were 12 and under, you had to be wearing a life jacket. If you're over 12, then they felt it was an amount of time that you could make that decision and not have to wear one, but you had to have it in the boat with you in case you needed to don it. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that today. It'll be for another episode. But what I will say is that I decided that my professional life would forever be changed in how I handle safety issues. My direction and focus would become this memorial and dedication to helping one person avoid injury at a time. Something that I still work towards today. If I can prevent one person from one injury, one person from one fatality, one person from getting hurt, I feel like it would be in honor of my son. I'm not looking for some kind of recognition. I'm not looking for any of that. I'm looking that if I can help someone, I may never know that I've helped someone, but I feel like if I live my life trying to do that, then I'm honoring my son, which is something for me that is helping me. And it'd be another 7 or 8 years before I would even entertain the idea of getting on a boat. And believe it or not, I ended up buying a boat in 2015 to help overcome my horror of being on the water. And it took a minute for me to get out on the water and get in that boat and actually ride with it and enjoy it. But I will say this, no one, including myself, could not get in that boat without a life preserver on. It was just my hard set rule. And eventually I was able to use David's tragedy in my safety training for others. The first time I mentioned it in one of my classes, I almost lost it because you don't realize how extremely delicate your grief is until you bring it right to that edge and talk about it. And then all of a sudden, these emotions come stirring up, and you find yourself just a basket case. And I found it was very, extremely difficult in trying to help somebody else. And in fact, for the first time I talked about it, I had to stop and not talk about it for a while because it was just too painful for me to mention. And I didn't feel like going through those emotions in front of everybody because I'm somewhat a private person. And I believe that for those of us who grieve, finding this way to talk about it and approach it can be very helpful in the grief process. For me, I would soon find out that almost every part of my life would now be different. You know, we often spend so much time with our occupations, they become an integral part of our lives. Mine would be changed forever. In a matter of a couple of months, I began doing what many say is not a healthy way to approach grief, and that is making big changes. So for many of us experiencing the pain of loss, this huge hole develops in our lives, and the emptiness that follows can often lead us to make swift changes. Some may be good, while others can be incorrect. That can lead to problems, and sometimes they do. For me, the emptiness brought depression and loneliness, thus making the choice to move back to Texas very obvious. All my family was there, and I knew it would come with challenges, and it did. But looking back now, I know it was the right move. So there I was, taking on a new position, moving back to my hometown, and shortly thereafter moving into a new home. 3 big changes. Thank goodness I had some family that was close enough that I could at least lean on some, although I don't think they knew exactly how to help with my grief because they couldn't. But there I was, I'm back in my hometown and close to my family. And for the next 4 years, I would discover exactly what that meant as my mother's health began to decline. I'd been so buried in my emotional battle, I didn't even really think about how this affected my mother. I'm certain she just did her thing, which was to try to stay strong for me. And now as I think back, I cannot imagine how difficult it was for Mom to grieve for her grandson, for my son David. You know, often when we grieve, it becomes very easy to get so closed in with our own grief that we can easily miss the grief of others associated with our loss. And it may not be my place at that point in time to have to worry about their grief, but they are grieving as well. So it's a good thing to know and have in the back of your mind because there's others that can grieve as well. Now, Mom's, her concern was for me and my grief, as it would be for most mothers. It's a tough question that many of us may not consider, but how does the loss of my loved one affect my family? And more than likely, it's their loved one too, if it's your family. No doubt I was in no place to ponder that because I was still consumed with my loss. But after those big changes, I began my attempt at trying to be normal again. I honestly wonder just how normal we ever get after these great losses we have, but I tried. And as I look back, I realized that I was very distracted. It was during the first year or two following my son's death that I found myself so distracted, and in that first year or so, I would end up suffering a crushed finger at work and lose the tip of my finger right there. Imagine that. I lost my son and then went through an injury due to distraction while I was trying to help others stay safe, because it happened at work. And within a year, I would learn that my father had dementia and that he would pass in the following year. Now, thank goodness that his dementia didn't last very long. He didn't have to suffer very long because it's one of the most horrendous diseases, dementia and Alzheimer's, that there is. But I had not even got past losing my son when my dad died. And so when he passed, my stepmother chose not to have a full funeral. However it came about, I don't really question it now because I wasn't in any place then to question it. But they opted for a memorial service in the church in Fort Worth. And once again, I was not in the best place to question anything. But when I was informed that there would be no burial service and that she chose to allow his remains to be handled by the military in Arlington, basically just, here, take care of this, I was stunned. So one of the family members brought his ashes there, and basically they were just going to put it in the vault, and they have a little ceremonial thing that they do. Nothing said, and she was okay with that. And she proceeded to tell us if we wanted to say something or have somebody say something, it was up to us. And then once again, I was just aghast at how she was handling this and couldn't imagine that nothing would be said for my father at his graveside. My family knew that I'd perform funerals and requested that I say something, or I volunteered, maybe both. And not wanting to show anyone that I was really not in a good place to do this, I agreed to do it and performed this burial service. Nothing fancy, but just something to honor him. And once again, I was just basically numb and going through this the best way I could. So within a little over a year, I'd lost my son and now my father. So now, on top of the grief I was already walking, I had yet another death to pile on top of that. My dad was a big supporter of me. He would call me at least once a week, if not more. And on every one of those calls, he would always make sure and tell me how proud he was of me. And now, suddenly, that was gone. Now think about a song that I hold dear today, and hopefully you can find things like this as well, because it helps me to relive and to approach that grief. But it's a song that's entitled 5 More Minutes, and it relates very well with where I was at. If I could only have 5 more minutes with my son David to tell him how proud I was of him and how much I loved him, although I did this a lot. If I could only have another 5 more minutes to talk to my dad and have nothing more to hear him say that I was going to be okay and that he was going to be proud of me. And now as I'm doing these podcasts, I'm realizing that I'm opening up some of those old grief wounds, as I truly never allowed myself to really grieve over my dad. Some of that is still very fresh, and it's been years. I spoke about my grief process being likened to this bookshelf after I went to a grief counselor, and she basically informed me that that's how she related my grief. And on that shelf lies these volumes of my grief. I had put one there because of my son, and now a second one resided there with my dad. And they'll always be there. They'll never leave. But it's up to us to pull these books down. And I firmly believe we have these books on our shelf that need to be opened from time to time. For my son, my grief is a daily walk. Oftentimes it's easier than others, but I realize from time to time that I need to pull that book off and really open it up and read it. With my dad, I've kept that one up on the shelf a lot longer and hadn't opened it up much at all, because I never really moved past the anger part of grief with him. And many of us who experience grief will walk through a period of anger, and for various reasons. It becomes very difficult to keep that anger contained at times as well. So let me just ask you the question. Have you experienced anger during your journey of grief? How did you handle it? Did it affect those around you? Those are questions that I'm curious to hear from others on, just to know how you handled it. And as we move forward, I'd love to hear those stories of your grief, because I do believe it's those stories that we share with each other that help us to understand our grief, maybe open up to it, and maybe address it a little bit better, or maybe not address it that way. But all in all, they can be helpful to us. So as we wrap this episode up, allow me just to remind you, or those who are grieving, to find a right time, which is far better than that time finding you, and pull that grief off the shelf and open it up. Deal with it. It may only be in small portions, but open that book and spend a little time. Maybe only a chapter, maybe only a few paragraphs, if I can say it that way. I'll tell you this, if you do not do that, you may find yourself where I am in putting this together. I literally had to walk away and grieve some before continuing this. So as we close today, please remember those who are grieving over the tragic loss in New Orleans from New Year's Eve. And there's others, but that's just the one that sticks out. These people are suffering tremendously and need support. So keep them in your prayers and thoughts, and God bless you until next time. Stay strong and tune in for next episode.